Hello and welcome to PM Champ, PMP Exam Preparation Tips. Today I am going to talk about the different kinds of contract types. This will help you to understand the three major types of contract types used within the PMP exam questions. First of all, a few tips on helping you to understand what are the key assumptions and key track points that you should always assume. Number one, while attempting the PMP questions, always assume that you are the buyer unless it is clearly specified that you are the seller. So always remember, you should always consider yourself as the buyer. Number two, contracts are formal documents between the buyer and the seller. So everything should be as clearly specified as possible. Contracts are also enforceable in courts of law. Therefore, these are legal documents. Number three, any change in the contract must be done in writing and only through the integrated change control process. Number four, only approved change request must make it to the contract. Therefore, if there is any change to the contract, it must be approved and in writing. Number five, contracts will help to reduce the risk on a project. Therefore, it is good to have contracts which will help you to eliminate or reduce risk. Number six, in some countries, more importance is given to building relationships more than enforcing the contract. In such cases, the contracts are simple documents that may not be very elaborate, as most of the work is agreed or through word of mouth discussions, and the honor of the seller and the buyer is there in getting things done. So if you come from such a country or background where contracts are not very formal and rather more importance is given to relationships, then you have a lot to learn. That's because from the PMI's perspective, all such things do not matter. All that matters is what is written in the contract. If it is not in the contract, then it is not part of the scope. Now let's look at the different contract types. The first one is called a fixed price contract. Here, in the fixed price contract, cost is fixed between the buyer and the seller. So the seller is at the most risk of cost increase. The buyer is at safety. So this is good for common products and services which are readily available and the specifications are pretty well defined. Seller's focus is on the statement of work to ascertain the scope and work out the cost and the time estimates. Remember FPBB. By memorizing this phrase, finish PMP by the book. If you remember FPBB, this should remind you that fixed price contract is best for buyer. So the FPBB will tell you fixed price contract is best for buyer. Remember this for the PMP exam. You can get many exam questions correct just by remembering this point. On the other extreme is the cost reimbursable contracts. In a cost reimbursable contract, the buyer agrees to pay whatever is the cost of the work done. So cost is paid on actuals as per the receipts and bills submitted by the seller to the buyer. Plus, there can be an agreed upon profit for the seller to earn, which could be either a fixed price or a percentage of the cost. Therefore, the buyer pays for the cost plus the profit. A buyer is at the most risk in cost plus contracts, because if the cost increases, the cost of the contract also increases. So you can remember the phrase CRBS by memorizing the phrase cut rows by stem. CRBS. What does this do? This will remind you that CRBS means cost reimbursable contracts is best for the seller. So this is another second important tip for you. Cost reimbursable contracts are best for the seller. That means they are worst for the buyer. Why? Because of cost exposure. Now let's look at a simple case study. Let's say I want to get a house built for my family and I need it ready in the next 6 months. So as a buyer, what kind of contract would I like? Fixed price or a contract where the cost increases depending on the cost of the material and labor? Of course, I would prefer a fixed price contract so that I know clearly what will be the price from the very beginning. If I can afford it, I will ask the provider to go ahead. If I can't afford it, I don't have to start. Further, if the cost of building material increases, the cost of labor increases, I should not be the person on risk. It should be the construction manager's job to find out. The seller should be at risk in such cases. So, I would want that the seller should absorb all the cost variations at his or her end. Now, this may impact the seller's profit margin, but then it is the seller's problem, not mine, because I am the buyer. So remember, this means that almost all of the risk in a fixed price contract belongs to the seller. As a buyer, I don't have any cost risk. So when to use a fixed price contract? Sellers generally will be willing to bid for a fixed price contract only if you can see the work, which is the scope, very clearly, and they are confident of completing it easily with a good profit margin. If the work is not cut out clearly, that means the scope is not clearly available or is not given in detail, then the sellers won't bite. Now the buyer is at an advantage in a fixed price contract, but remember, if the scope is not clear and the seller still bids for it and you accept it, then you still have some risk. What if the seller finds out the detailed scope and realizes that the cost is more than he anticipated, or that the actual work will wipe out their entire profit margin? In such cases, the seller may suddenly lose interest in your project, get busy elsewhere, and you, the buyer, may have to look for other choices like close the contract, look for another vendor, which is a risk for you. And whatever you have paid for receiving only part of the work may be lost too. Further, you might also lose the time and money. So what are the advantages of a fixed price contract? Number 1, less work for the buyer to manage. Number 2, the seller has a strong incentive to control the cost. So companies usually have experience with this type of contract because the buyer knows the total price exposure when the project starts. What are the disadvantages of a fixed price contract? Number 1, sellers may underprice the work and try to make up for profits using change orders. Some sellers may not complete the work as per the statement of work if they begin losing money. Thirdly, more work for the buyer to write the contract statement of work. Remember, fixed price contracts mean clear statement of work. Therefore, you need to do the hard work of writing down everything clearly. So, fixed price contracts can be more expensive than cost reimbursable contracts if the contract statement of work is incomplete. In that case, the cost keeps on increasing because of change requests, which are, the seller will try to portray that this was extra work, it was not specified in the very beginning. Now let's look at when to use a cost reimbursable contract. Generally, companies do not prefer to use a cost reimbursable contract because of the increased exposure to cost. However, the buyer may have no choice, especially if they don't have the expertise in the desired area or the scope is not clearly defined. The buyer may not have the technical competence to define the scope clearly, or there is only one vendor who can fulfill your requirements. That means there is a monopoly where the vendor can dictate their terms. Examples are when you want to do a project in a far away country where you do not know the local customs, culture, and still need to form alliance with a local company. Just think, would you be interested in giving you, will they be interested in giving you a fixed price contract limiting their profitability? They would definitely want a cost reimbursable contract plus a hefty profit margin for helping you out. Another example is in the research and development. Let's say you want to create a cure for cancer or AIDS because you know that the profit will be enormous if you find the right medicine. But if you don't have the right skill or know-how, you have to find a good biomedical company who will get a group of scientists who can assist you to research and find the medicine. In such a case, they would prefer to get all of their expenses covered and a hefty salary as an incentive to work for you. So they would definitely want a cost reimbursable project. What are the advantages of a cost reimbursable contract? Number one, simpler contract statement of work. Usually requires less work to develop the scope than fixed price contracts. This is one of the reasons is that the scope is not clear and not much detail is available anyway. If the detail was available, we would have opted for a fixed price contract. Secondly, the price of such a contract may seem lower because the seller does not have to add as much price for risk. And anyway, in a cost reimbursable contract, all costs are covered anyway. So what are the disadvantages of a cost reimbursable contract? Number one, the buyer is required to do the auditing of the seller's invoices. Number two, seller, you will be required to work for it requires more work for you to manage the seller, as the seller has no incentive to control the cost. The total price is unknown from the very beginning. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of a cost reimbursable contract. Now let's look at the third kind of contract, the time and material contract. In a time and material contract, we create this kind of contract when the buyer wants to be more in control of the work and supervise it closely and be involved in the day-to-day management of the resources. A time and material contract is created. This involves the least amount of work by the seller. All they need to do is find a good required skilled resource for you and send him or her to do the work at your office location. Generally, this is good if the duration of the project is short term. How short is short term? Anywhere from a few weeks to a few months. If you remember the early 90s, there was a boom in India as a number of software engineers wanted to work in the US at lower salaries compared to the local IT programmers in the US. This gave rise to the concept of body shopping, which was a way of doing time and material contracts. The cheaper IT programmers were placed in the US company's office to do the work, and the company placing the work had to do nothing except for processing the visa and arrange for the person to travel and find accommodation in the initial few days. Both the buyer and the seller are at equal risk. If the person doing the work is not skilled enough, then the contract can be terminated. On the other hand, if the buyer does not have enough time to supervise the activities of a time and material contract resource, then you are paying for their services, but the resource may not be doing much work. So some hot tricks for you. Number one, a fixed price contract is best for the buyer if the scope is clear. Number two, a fixed price contract is worst for the seller if the scope is not clear. A cost reimbursable contract is best for the seller if the project is long-term and the scope is not clear. And a cost reimbursable contract is worst for the buyer in terms of risk and cost. A time and material contract is best for short projects. A time and material contract is best when the buyer wants to supervise the activities of the seller's resource. Hope this will help you in understanding the different contract types better. Of course, we have more detailed videos for each of these contract types in our PMP coaching workshop, which are part of the PM Champs coaching workshop program. This is a 6-week program where every day a 1-hour video is released. In detail, we cover one process or one aspect of the PMP examination and go through in detail, and I will explain to you the concept. Then we do some review questions on a day-to-day basis, and of course members also have access to a members only forum where they can ask any question they have, and I'll normally respond to them quickly so that they can understand the new concepts and apply them on the PMP exam questions. Hope this helps you. All the best.